Welcome. Our topic today is making the case for moving file shares to the cloud. For additional background on moving file shares to the cloud, make sure you check the resources out at the end of the presentation and the team's blog this month. Whether you're thinking about planning your file shares migration to the cloud or already have started this journey, I'm sure you'll get something out of today's information. So with me today is our organizational change management team. We've got Noah Sparks, Pierre-Yves Delacote, Tim Lynch, and with the collaboration team, we have Michael Van Cleve and Matt Barger. Welcome, team. We're so glad to have you back joining us on the program. I think it was back in April when we had you here talking about Viva and giving some updates there. So thank you and welcome. I also hope you'll be back next month as we talk about the Ignite recap. So definitely join us back. Mark your calendars to come back. We'll release the dates pretty soon here in the next newsletter. But we definitely want to make sure that you're aware of joining us next month, I'm sorry, for the Ignite recap, which is always a favorite of our customers. So before we get started, let's quickly go over the agenda, making the case. Why are we going to do, why do you do this, right? Like, what's the benefits? How are you going to, from a business standpoint, from a technology standpoint, why would we do this, right? And so many people have started this journey to the cloud, but really have not made any movement on the file share part. So we're going to explain why this is important, why you should take advantage of this. Then we're going to go into how to get started and give you some helpful tips there on how to get started. And then obviously we'll wrap up with useful resources. And we got a whole bunch of questions that came in advance, so we're going to hopefully have some time to answer all those questions. If we don't get to something, by all means, we will definitely follow up afterwards. If you do have questions, again, please put them in the chat window and we'll make sure we'll get to them as well. So thanks again. So let's go ahead and get started with the first poll question. Go ahead and launch that first poll question. Casey, if you could. So the first thing we want to know is, where are you in this journey? Have you started to move any of your file shares to the cloud? And all of them? I'd be surprised if anyone says all of them. Majority of them, only a few, none. Interesting. Wow. So this is great. This session is definitely going to be for you today, and hopefully you'll get something out of this. We'll check back on these poll questions because we got a lot to do today. So we'll go ahead and check back on these in a little bit. So someone keep an eye on that for me on the team. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk about making the case. Why would we migrate these files to the cloud? The OCM team is going to start this conversation. It's going to be like an informal route. Just anybody can speak up and talk about the business side of this, why we're making the changes. And just one heads up about the guidelines of this conversation today. We had a question come in about, what about non-collaborative files being migrated to the cloud? Certainly that is a possibility, right? Setting up an Azure subscription, moving those files to Azure, maybe even for archival purposes using cold storage. That is not the focus today, but it's certainly something that is available for you all to do. And we definitely suggest you taking a look at that and reaching out to us if that's something you have some more questions about. But the focus for today is really moving collaborative files up to the cloud and why you would do that and what's the business reasons for doing that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Pierre-Yves, and we call him PY, and the rest of the OCM team. Go ahead, PY, take it over.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, so why migrating the files in the cloud? So let me share some experience we had with a lot of customers. We saw that when customers are keeping their file shares with Microsoft 365 on the side, people don't fully engage in the collaboration because they have to switch from context from, sometimes I'm going to go in the file share, sometimes I'm going to go in Teams or SharePoint or OneDrive. And so at the end of the day, people who are not convinced or not, educated enough or just most of the people are still working and depending heavily on their file shares. They're gonna not take advantage of the cloud. So the context switching is really a tax when you have to manage files that are stored in your file shares. Obviously, file shares have a lot of issues. And when even if you have Microsoft 365, and that's most of the case of our customers, they don't fully embrace the cloud because of that, because they're still working in the cloud, in the file on premise. So that's the first reason we see more and more customers willing to move all their documents we were talking about collaborative documents in the cloud to allow people to work in the cloud and take benefit of the cloud. And the benefits are, the accessibility. Obviously, you don't have to VPN in, and if you have a bad VPN, I can tell you a lot of customers are users are not satisfied to have to VPN in, and the consequence of using VPN to access a file is that people are going to share and collaborate on documents by sending their emails with attachments because they don't want to go through the VPN to just access a file that is referenced in an email. So that's the accessibility is a big problem with file shares. The fact that when you work on a document that is open by somebody else, it's locked. So I had customers who were entering their timesheet at the end of the day. It was the same timesheet for everybody. They had to wait that everybody has finished to close the document so they can have access to the file. Also, it gives more business autonomy depending on your governance. But people can manage the permission, which is not the case usually
Yeah.
with file shares. So the cloud is more flexible for that. Obviously, there's also some benefits in terms of cost, and having a file share is really expensive. But still, if you're using a lot of storage in Microsoft 365, you need to look at, and we'll discuss the capacity of Microsoft 365. But you might have a little bit of overhead sometimes if you want to increase the file storage in Microsoft 365. But
Yep.
also the benefit of going into the cloud is you enable tons of new services that are going to leverage your files, like the
Yeah.
Power Platforms with Power Automate, Power Apps. So if you don't put your files in the cloud, then you cannot leverage those files within those applications. And I also I had that recently in the deck, but the future also is very promising with Microsoft Syntex and Viva, and in general with AI, because AI will help us in the future to organize those files automatically thanks to AI, thanks to Viva Topics, thanks to Microsoft Syntex, and that's a big potential. If you have your files on premise, you won't be able to leverage that. And there's some security aspects. I think Ken's going to talk about it.
Yeah, so just a couple things on this slide I want to make sure we hit on as well. From a technical debt standpoint, if you've got big SAN storage systems that are becoming end of life, now is the perfect time to start thinking about making the change to the cloud instead of reinvesting in a huge SAN system for your on-premise environment. Those things are very expensive. I used to pay the maintenance on them at the state of North Carolina, I know. But if you be aware of your end of life of your hardware and keep an eye on those contract dates for maintenance renewals and things like that, and try to time your migration around that, right? Other things, every tenant comes with 1 TB, no matter how many users you have, every tenant comes with 1 TB of storage plus 20 GB per license, right? So I know in the state of North Carolina, we had like 600 TB of storage just sitting there ready to be used, and we weren't even tapping into it, right? So at least not initially. So if you've got all that storage, why wouldn't you use it? Why wouldn't you take advantage of that, especially when you start talking about all the advantages we're going to be talking about here on this slide and the next slide. And then, PY talked about the taking advantage of Power Platform solutions to build business applications, right? So by having these files in the cloud or these lists, Microsoft lists or things like that, instead of being them on-prem, which you'd have to build a data gateway, and then as soon as you build the data gateway, that now costs you money to do Power Apps, right? So if you're using everything natively in the 365 ecosystem, there's no cost, right? So as long as your file shares and your lists and data, all those things are in the cloud in Office 365, there's no cost to build those Power Apps for your internal users. So definitely some things to think about there. And I think PY hit on some other great items there. Now, if you run out of storage, I think we had a question come in on this, and I'll go ahead and answer it right now. If you run out of storage, you can certainly, there's an add-on storage capability. So you can buy it on a per gigabyte basis. It's about 20 cents per gigabyte per month. That equates to about $2.40 or $2,400 a year for a terabyte of storage. Now that may seem like a lot of money, but wait till we get to the next slide and you can see all the security that you're getting built in and the resiliency and stuff that's all built into this. Team, did I miss anything else on the business side of this? Please speak up right now if you have other business ideas that we didn't hit on here before we get to security.
This is Michael. So one of the things that I think we're going to talk a little bit more about when we get further down the slide deck is going to be, user effectiveness and efficiency. And, PY kind of mentioned the whole idea of being on a VPN or context switching between the file server and the online environment. And ultimately what it comes down to is you are losing efficiency as a user whenever you've got to switch back and forth, and findability becomes a problem. So we'll talk more about that a little bit later and some strategies, but ultimately that's the ultimate goal, right? Is making sure that our users are efficient and effective and able to find the things they need in a timely manner.
Right. Thanks, Michael. Anything else from the team? All right. No? Okay. We'll move on to making the case now from a technical and security standpoint. So, think about this. Obviously, your on-premise file shares require maintenance costs for the SAN, patching every month. That's a lot of FTE time. The other thing is resiliency. What is the SLA, or what's the there's two more. Hold on. Do we have a question, or is that just some background noise? If so, let's go ahead and mute those folks. Okay, so built-in resiliency, typically on-premise systems are maybe built around 3 nines, but I would dare to say that they're probably not 4 nines reliability and resiliency. So that's one thing to be aware of here with Office 365 and the SharePoint backend that's built in Azure. It's built on 4.9 capability, which is pretty amazing. E-discovery, once you get all your files in one place, e-discovery becomes a whole lot easier because you're looking at one place now and one tool to do all e-discovery. So that's a huge win for moving your files to the cloud. We talked about context switching. Well, the biggest problem with context switching is because people send attachments, right? So version control, another huge thing that has to do with attachments and context switching, right? So, just making sure that people are working on the latest document without, being able to send links. Like you can't do that on-prem typically, right? So, sending links really helps with staying focused on the source of truth document that you're working on, not having 15 documents through email attachments and things like that. That's a huge time killer if you're sending attachments over email. So version control is another huge win here from a technical standpoint. Ransomware protection. And the ability to restore those files built right into Office 365 and OneDrive and SharePoint. And then obviously security and compliance. So building these capabilities for other services in the Office 365 ecosystem now take advantage across all your file shares as well. Things like data loss prevention, Microsoft information protection, data retention, and data governance. Everything in one place, one security model for all your files makes it a whole lot more efficient. Anything else before I move on, folks, from the team?
Ken, I just thought of something that I did not have you add to this slide. Co-authoring.
Perfect. I didn't even think about that. That's exactly right. Co-authoring. What a huge time saver. In fact, you and I were just doing that last week. In fact, Michael created a really cool loop component. If you're not familiar with loops, Michael, I'll let you talk about loop, but he created a loop component right inside of a Teams chat. We updated that loop component and updated the document at the same time. That was pretty amazing. So very cool capabilities with co-authoring there. So these are things I just want to make sure people are aware of, because you need to make sure you're aware of all these things before you take the step into this file migration, right? Things like, and I mentioned this first one, it probably doesn't pertain to most folks, but for our tribal customers, which we were just at a conference last month in Reno, they're very concerned about data sovereignty. How do you control the data once it's up in the cloud? Can you get it back? Can it be subpoenaed? Those things so check your contracts. That's what I have to say about this. We did a session on this at TribalNet last month. Check your contracts, make sure your legal team is involved in there, so to make sure that you have the right legal term and verbiage in your contracts, but also make sure you have the right licensing and security put in place. Make sure you are the one who controls the keys for that data, that you have total control over how that data is being used and who has access to it. Customer lockbox, another thing. From a OneDrive standpoint, make sure that you realize that there's a lot of defaults in Microsoft 365. Things like default like 30-day retention on OneDrive. If people don't know that that's the default, somebody gets offboarded. Next thing you know, OneDrive is not a permanent storage. It'll be deleted within 30 days if you don't change that default. Now, there is some capabilities for automation and to give the person's manager access to that OneDrive if you have the manager field filled out in Azure Active Directory or Azure AD. But if you haven't set that up and you haven't changed your retention schedule, that content is gone and there's no getting it back after about 30 days. I think there's a couple recycle bins that then extended to 93 days, but there's no reason why you can't change that 30-day retention to maybe 180 days. Or if it's somebody that's really important, that's a position that has to be kept forever, put it on legal hold. You can certainly do those things, right? If you have the right licensing in place. And most people do for that kind of capability. I mentioned this on the other slide. SharePoint is 99.99% SLA backed, right? So it's built on Azure, built on SQL. And the SharePoint system itself actually uses append-only storage. So what does that mean? It means that this is the process that files can't be changed or corrupted after the initial save, protecting it from attackers trying to corrupt old versions. So by default, I don't know if you know this, but by default, there's actually 500 versions of every single file you upload there in SharePoint. Most people usually bring that back down to around 100, anywhere from 100 to 200 or so. But that does eat up some of your tenant shared space. That is one thing that definitely eats up some of your space. So you want to make sure that versioning is kept under control, that you take a proactive approach to setting those defaults, and that you understand how it's being used against your storage. Now, OneDrive storage does not go against your storage for your tenant, but SharePoint certainly does. And SharePoint is going to outlive a user. It's going to stay up there permanently until someone takes it down, unless you have some other retention schedule put on it. SharePoint Online and OneDrive has ransomware protections built right into it, so you can restore back to a point in time, which is really, really cool. Microsoft's got lots of documentation about how to take care of this. But again, it's built right into the product. They'll only attack that last version or so, and so it's you can just restore right before that situation happened, and you're good to go. There's some resources at the end of this presentation today to talk about more about ransomware, resiliency, redundancy, and how ransomware is, how Microsoft protects against ransomware. So definitely check out those links at the very end. I'm gonna stop there. Anybody got any other comments about security or technical things that people may or may not know about SharePoint or OneDrive? I think we did a good job hitting those, but I might have missed something. All right. So again, these are things that probably you don't have on, you obviously don't have them on your on-premise file shares, right? You don't have append-only storage, possibly. You don't have a 99.9% backed SLA. You're not monitoring 24 trillion security signals, which Microsoft does every single day, which is insane. 24 trillion signals, right? That's insane that they're monitoring every day. And all that intelligence is feeding into the Microsoft ecosystem and the security graph on the back end of the Office 365 services that are protecting you. So the reason why I included this slide is Microsoft's approach to security once your files are up there is to really protect them no matter where it lives. I mean, it could be on a USB drive, right? So first thing you need to know is know your data. What kind of data do you have? Apply the right security to it from a sensitivity standpoint, protecting your data, putting on controls to prevent data leaks and things like that through data loss prevention. And then obviously governing your data, making sure that you have a plan on how you're going to govern and be compliant with your data, right? So the reason why I put this slide on here is I want to make sure that everyone's aware of what Microsoft Purview is, and that's really the suite of services that now is the umbrella for all these capabilities to protect your data, right? So make sure that you're familiar with this term. You start doing some research on the capabilities of what's all inside of Microsoft Purview, things like information protection, data loss, lifecycle management. There's automation in the way that you do retention of documents. So you don't want to keep things longer than you have to from a legal standpoint, probably, but you also don't want things to go away too soon by accidental deletion, right? So definitely some thoughts around some capabilities around that. I won't go through all these because we've got a lot of slides to go through, but just make sure you're aware of that. If you're going to move your files to the cloud, be aware of what suite of services actually protect those files, and be aware of how you want to manipulate them to make sure that they meet your compliance and governance capabilities that you have at your own personal location or organization. All right. So how do we get started? I'll let the governance team start with this one. I mean, the OCM team start with this one. Getting started.
Yeah, so maybe first, it's important when you deploy Microsoft 365 in general to implement the right governance. It's not just about educating users to use the technology and having the files in the cloud. It's also aligning how people work, what they can and can't do. So usually there's a technical aspect of the governance, but there's also a user aspect of what we call best practices to align how people are working with files. So that's the first thing. Also, we leverage heavily survey, and the OCM team is really advocating for the end users. So it's also establishing through the survey. It's the first way to establish a dialogue with your end users. And a survey will show you an example of a survey. Will help us to understand if there's going to be any resistance when you're going to move your file shares and what is the best way. There's different scenario to move your file shares in the cloud. So, sending a survey is not agreeing with the answers, but at least it can help you to understand what are the resistance eventually, or what will be the best fit. And obviously, you need to plan some training just to discuss about the best practices and eventually maybe re-energize how people are using the technology in Microsoft 365. And on the technical side, I think it's really important to have an inventory, and Michael going to talk about this and to see, if everything is really eligible to Microsoft 365 or some stuff can, even documents, some documents, maybe older documents, archived documents, you might want to move them in Azure. And there's some criteria like how often the documents are consumed, how old they are, etc., etc. So there's some approaches that Michael is going to describe. And really, it's to really think about how you're going to approach the migration. There's different strategy, different tools. We'll talk about that in a second. And there's really, in terms of strategy, we'll see that in a few seconds. But you can have a strategy. The simplest strategy for IT is to copy paste. That might not be the best strategy. So we'll discuss that in a few moments. But we'll start with some element of the governance that Michael going to describe now.
Yeah, and something I was just thinking about, PY, and I know you've seen this before in some of the surveys you've done, is you may survey the folks and find out there's files in Google Drive, there's files in other third-party systems. Like, you've totally lost control over those files, and from a data loss prevention standpoint, so it's eye-opening, right? So again, I think the survey is definitely a useful tool to figure out if you're not blocking those things, at the perimeter level of your identities, which most people aren't yet until they get into Defender for Cloud Apps. Surveying those users, finding out where they're putting their files, that could be an eye-opening experience and could very be scary. That's for sure.
Just it's a very good point. Just to give you share with you an anecdote. I was doing an interview with a customer, and the person was telling me that to access his file share, he has to VPN in, take control, remote control of his computer to have access to a document, and then he sent it to his personal email to work from home because there was no bring your own device policy. So it's not just understanding the users is really key. It's really key because then you cannot imagine how agile are the end users when they don't have a solution. They will find a solution that will be under your radar. So you won't see what they're doing, and that's what we call shadow IT. Even if you control everything, they'll find a solution to have access to those documents. They want to work from home, and they don't want to go back to the office just to have access to a document, modify the document. So it's really key to have a dialogue. A survey is not a real dialogue. It's a first dialogue to have a trend of what's going on in the organization. But also having interviews can help to better understand, some use cases, some struggles that can be addressed with a good governance.
And with that, let's talk about governance for a second. So I have a definition of governance that I've used in the past. I think it works really well. And here it is. Governance is the set of policies, roles, responsibilities, and processes that guide, direct, and control how an organization's business divisions and IT teams cooperate to achieve business goals. In other words, this is all about defining the services, how they will work, what the customers can do with them, and how the services will be supported, right? So it's a handshake between the business and the IT to make sure that we're all in support of exactly how these services are defined and we can support them and they follow the policies of the organization and hopefully meet the needs of the business. That's what the ultimate goal is, right? So Michael, talk to us a little bit why it's important to gain control over governance before day one. Before you start moving your files to the cloud, here's some things like, talk about this for us.
Sure. So the governance for the tenant in general is wider than just SharePoint and OneDrive and things of that nature. However, ultimately what the governance is going to do is provide the users kind of a roadmap of how to use the system in your organization effectively, the way you want them to, based on the policies that you set forth. So some of these will be, things that the users are going to see firsthand. Others are going to happen in the background that are going to keep them kind of on the rails, right? As Ken had mentioned, when you've got any sort of tool that the users don't take to or they don't understand, and it's in their way to get to their end goal, might be collaborating on a document or something along those lines, they're going to find a way to get it done. And it may not be within the policies that you set forth. And a good example of that Ken brought up is taking the data out and putting it in, say, Google Drive or in Box, or even emailing it when essentially a link can be shared if it's within the cloud already. So on the things that, affect the system, we want to provide those policies in which the users are using it in the way that you expect or want them to. Who can create a site? Who can create a team? Are those things locked off to where only certain people can? When it gets into, say, a site or a team, usually that's where the user's domain kind of picks up. And do they need extra libraries or lists, or what do they need in their site? And that's what they control. But you, in some cases, depending on the organization, may not allow them to create that site automatically. They may have to go and request that site. Other organizations might be wide open. And interestingly enough, on that particular subject, I've got an example of a client who they had rolled out Teams, and they did not prevent the populace of users from creating their own teams. They ended up with 2,000 team sites of Deadpool 1, Deadpool 2, and it really made their IT organization very angry. But it was a great example of the reason to control your organization if you feel that that's necessary. And those controls are in there. Naming conventions, when you get into a larger organization, we deal with clients that, they might have multiple agencies within their organization, and then those agencies have departments. And with that, as an overall controller of the tenant, sometimes trying to weed through these various different teams or SharePoint sites, it's hard to understand what context they actually serve or who they serve. So we, again, recommend naming conventions that will help quickly identify who owns or what department or agency owns that area. Guest access. For some organizations, this is a no-go, depending on if they're in the government sector or maybe even the tribal sector. You may not allow guest access. So, you don't want your individual users be able to invite guests, or maybe they've got to go through a process to get that guest access first before they share something with that person. So all these are, again, things that you can provide the guide rails and users have to work within them. But then there's other areas where they're going to see that they can or cannot do something. And with that, we need to understand that to make sure that we're not blocking them from doing their job. We're just making sure they're doing their job in a way that is in line with the policies. We mentioned expiration policies. This is a big deal for a lot of organizations. One thing that I will task you to do is actually go to your file server. If you've got visibility into your full file server, look at how much old data is there. Look at the stuff that was supposed to be cleaned up but never was. So these expiration policies helps maintain the data freshness as well as the maintenance of the area that you have in your tenant that you've already paid for with your licenses. If a whole bunch of old junk is in there, you're wasting your resources, and you're making it to where you don't have as much space in the tenant as you could have for active documents or active files that people need to get to. So it is recommended to keep a clean house, and they provide those abilities and those processes in the tenant for you to be able to do that. The policies are hugely important. Retention, some things need never to be deleted. Others, it might be a 5-year or 7-year, 10-year. But again, unless you have that content in a system that is tracking the retention, or you've got some sort of e-discovery, some sort of place where you're putting them that e-discovery is taking place on, you're not controlling it. And when you don't control your content, you lose track of it. It's just out there, and you don't know what's good or what's bad or what's a liability potentially. Data loss prevention, Ken mentioned, with something along the lines of data loss prevention, a lot of organizations, they've got IP, they've got historical documents, they've got things like that need to be kept and not leaked outside the organization. So with that, again, extremely important. I won't go through all these, but at the same time, you're getting the main theme. We configure the environment so that the policies and procedures are adhered to, and then the users, all they have to do is work in the system, and they should be adhering to those policies that you set forth.
Yep. And I think the important thing there also, Michael, is, I said this earlier, is know what your defaults are in the tenant. Don't just blindly think that something's being retained for some period of time because it may not be correct, right? Know what your defaults are, be educated about what those are, and making sure you take a proactive approach to retention and compliance versus just a reactive and not aware of what the defaults are, right? So it's very important there.
The one last thing there is, this is an evolving area. As your organization evolves with policies and processes and things like that, the governance should be updated. So it should be looked at periodically and make sure it's still in line with the policies of the organization.
Absolutely. Great point there. Governance is a living thing. Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. I forgot about that. All right, so we got to move along here. We're running a little bit long. It's 1:36 already. So Michael, talk to us a little bit about tooling. How do people get started here moving their content?
Yeah, I'll try to speed through this really quickly. I think a lot of organizations that have made it to Office 365 already know that they've got tooling options. The one that we look at generally for file shares is very simple. It's the SharePoint migration tool. It's very utilitarian, so it's not by far anything that you're going to write home about as far as features and functionality, but it does its job. ShareGate is a for pay migration tool, and it actually has more than just migration abilities. But with that, it does actually do a really good job of giving you the ability to visualize what's being moved and things of that nature, and error reports are a little bit better. So things to consider. Depending on what tool you choose, you definitely need to look at what limitations you're going to have in the Office 365 environment. Some are by the environment, some are by the tool as far as limitations. Depending on what type of files you're using, if you've got extremely large files, those need to be considered because of the fact that there are certain limitations for those files to make it to the Office 365 environment. If you do have large files, generally, and I'll give you an example of like an ArcGIS file of some sort, you're not necessarily going to want to put that in SharePoint. That would probably go to Azure. Things that are excessively large, CAD files, things like that, they should probably go to Azure. But generally, a majority of what you're going to find in your file system or in your file server should be able to make the transition. This gets into the next points. So invalid characters and permissions. Invalid characters, if it's got any sort of, and the invalid characters are pretty well documented out there, but if it runs into files that have any of these invalid characters, it will not move them. They have to be remediated before they'll move. And that's just because you are moving to a web environment. So some characters just are not going to work for the URL schema. Permissions is another thing that, depending on how you're reorganizing or if you're reorganizing your content, those permissions on your file server may need to be updated, or they may not even be migrated to the environment. So with this, again, it really heavily depends on, are you synchronizing your groups to the Office 365 environment? And if that group is on-prem and in the environment, you should have no problems. But again, if those aren't, that will be a problem. Definitely look at the tool, make sure that it's going to migrate the permissions you expect, or, again, depending on how you reorganize, you may not need to worry about permissions. You're just going to go and assign them in process. And then when all this is said and done, when you actually do migrate the content and you get it all over into the cloud environment, it's imperative that you make the file shares read-only, because the problem that surfaces is you get the person that doesn't want to work in the cloud, and they're going to buck the trend, and they've been working in the file share for ever, it seems like, and that's what they know. And they will always go to what they know or what's easiest for them. So you do kind of have to force them a little bit to get into the cloud.
Excellent points. And we were talking about limitations. So this is kind of a summary slide of the limitations. There's some SharePoint limitations. There's some library limitations, certain file size limitations. Hopefully none of these are really going to be a problem for you all because they're pretty large. But file path, definitely one of them. Some of these file paths, if they're like 10 folders deep, could definitely be an issue. And then obviously file types, right? There's certain files that you may not want to move, shouldn't be moved, and should be blocked at all costs from being migrated up to the cloud. So we've given you some links here to look at that stuff. We talked about this long URL path issue, so I don't think it makes sense to go into any further information about that. Blocked file types, again, there's some files that SharePoint by default actually blocks, so you may have some problems moving some of those files. And then you have the choice also to block other file types on a customized basis for your own organization. Michael, just summarize, I guess, some of this stuff here on this slide, and then we'll get into some of the methods for moving files to the cloud.
Yeah, so here it's what I usually ask my clients to do. I'll let you guys read the slide and stuff like that, but I'm just going to give you all a version of it. Ultimately, what you need to do is look at how your file servers are structured. Are they still in the same sort of, I guess, structure that you would expect today? A lot of these file shares have been around for more than 20 years in some cases. So with that, one, you got old content. Two, you got a structure that may have fit the organization years ago, but it doesn't fit now. I mean, we all know of departments or parts of the organization may be dissolved, or they may be merged together, or whatever the case might be. So first, look at the documents, look at the file and folder structure, and see if they fit. If so, those can be migrated. And with that, though, what you're going to run into is, more often than not, your file server has more data than possibly the space that you have in your your SharePoint community storage. So if that is the case, some organizations don't have that problem, some organizations do. If that is the case, what I recommend is looking at the content from a perspective of what's active content, what are people working with today? And where do they need versioning? Where do they need co-authoring? Where do they need the ability to open it up in the web version of Office and work within the Office 365 environment and with all the goodness that comes with it? And then also look at files that, although they may be old, there is activity on them that a person needs to get to it once a week, maybe once a month. Okay, well, that can make it to the environment, to the Office 365 environment. But files that are maybe accessed once a year, or historical, that you need to work on grants and contracts and things like that, maybe those can still stay at the file server level. SharePoint is not a file server killer, but it's there to make your job easier when you're working with these files and retaining these files and everything else. So we definitely want to look at what should and should not be migrated from that lens. And then anything else, work a separate situation of, okay, are we moving to Office, or a file server within Azure to get the benefits there, or are we keeping it local?
Right. And the one thing I'm sure you didn't say, but you were kind of hinting around, that was, the specific type of file, right? So something that's very sensitive, while you think maybe I don't want to move it to the cloud, you actually have more security in the cloud, right? So you may want to consider moving your HR files to the cloud and putting specific sensitivity and DLP and all the other capabilities that you can protect them in the cloud, because you actually have those tools available to you as opposed to on-prem. So, just again, take a look at the files, what kind of files they are, and what kind of level of security or collaboration they need. If they're old files and you just need to keep them for archiving, send them to cold storage in Azure. Dirt cheap. Yep. All right, we're going to go back to the OCM team. Which tool to use? This is a topic that they're very familiar with, and also not which tool to use, but also where to move it to. Like, how do you make the decision and that kind of stuff? So what are the options and the ways to move the content to the cloud? Folks at OCM team, anybody can chime in.
Yeah, exactly. So really, after you decide to move your file share to the cloud, is where you're going to move them. So there are different scenarios. The first simple one I was talking about earlier is a copy paste approach. So usually you have a personal drive. Sometimes it's called U drive, other called G drive. I've seen all sort of names, but they're easily identified and you can move them in OneDrive. And then what about the other file shares, the public folders, department file shares? So you can say it's easy. I just have to replicate that or move that to SharePoint. So that's the first scenario. Then there's a second scenario, Ken, where you want to take advantage of the solution a little bit more. So you might want to look at what is really aim for SharePoint. SharePoint is more to share final documents. So what is really your final documents, your policy, whatever, and then you might want to move that in SharePoint. And all the other documents are what I call living documents and collaborative documents. Then you might want to move them in Teams because you want to promote Teams to collaborate on files. And the third scenario is a mix of everything. So it's moving because, and usually this scenario is used most of the time because it gives more flexibility. Especially when you don't have a lot of experience with Teams. So you first want to, move things in the cloud and then let people decide what if they're going to move their SharePoint documents in Teams. And by the way, SharePoint documents can be linked to a team pretty easily. And so you let the user decide when they're very familiar with Teams and they better understand how they can leverage Teams. They can figure out, oh, I think this SharePoint site should be my team now. So now I'm ready to move it in Teams. So there are 3 different scenarios, and they all have pros and cons. It's in the next slide. So when you mimic, it's not transformative. You're not. It's moving. One time, a CIO told me, "I don't want to move the mess in the cloud. It's still a mess, even if I have a lot of benefits because of the cloud. But I'm responsible for this, so I don't want to have this mess there." So it's not transformative because then people are going to use SharePoint like if it was a file storage, and it's definitely not the case. And the other scenario, there's pros and cons also. I will say that, as I say, the mix scenario is probably the easier, not the easier, the most used scenarios because people want to have the time to understand, what's going in Teams and what's not going in Teams. But it can take time. It can take time to transition little by little the user to this new environment. So there's no real good solution. It depends on the maturity of your users, how transformative you want to be in this effort. So it's a discussion with end users, again, a dialogue. And I think, I'm not sure if it's the next slide, but there's a way to have this dialogue. So the survey is the way. You were on the survey. We skipped the survey. So the survey is to have the first dialogue. Here's a survey we ran for a customer, and we asked the end user first, do you want to move your documents in the cloud? They all say yes. And then it was, how do you want? Do you want IT to move your drive as is, like copy paste? And as you can see, most of them don't really want that. And we asked them then, do you want to clean the file share before moving the file shares in the cloud? And apparently that was a lot of people said yes. It's surprising because most of the time maybe they say yes and they won't do it because they didn't do it in the file share. but still they understand that's a problem. That's a good thing to know, is that at least they're willing to clean, and maybe with some incentives. So I'm going to give you examples of other customers I work with. They put in place a campaign where they ask the people to clean their files before migrating into the cloud, and they give an incentive. And every week or every other week, they were saying, "Hey, we saved that amount of gigabytes because you cleaned. Thank you." And then also we ask people, do you want to reorganize? That's more touchy, because then, how are you going to reorganize your file shares to be moved in the cloud? And that takes time, because you need to think. Cleaning is easier, but reorganizing your folders is a little bit more complicated, because sometimes you have folders you don't even remember what somebody created the folder structure, and you don't really remember what was the logic, because there were no governance. So that survey can help you to decide, how you can how you can work with the end users, and what is the best strategy to move your files.
Excellent.
And it's key. It's I cannot
overemphasize this one.
Overemphasize this. You need to educate end users, not just about what the tools are doing. Yes, it's true. It's doing co-authoring. It's doing version. There's better version control. There's a lot of benefit in terms of usage. But even if you do that, if you educate them on how to use the technology, I can guarantee that I have a lot of engagement with customers who already have deployed Microsoft 365, and they're not satisfied how people are using the cloud. And it's not just because they don't know how to use the technology. It's because they're not aligned. Some people are doing the right things. Other people are doing completely different. They use different. They work in different with different use cases. So it's really key to define your best practices. So at least it's not to enforce. In general, enforcing governance is not successful, but you need to have a governance. You need to have common protocols that you share with everybody. So at least they have a common thing to refer to. And so some example here, where to store your files. I'm working with a file. I don't know where. If you can come back on the slide, I'm working on a file. I don't know where to store it. Do I need to store it in SharePoint, OneDrive, or Teams? It can be very complicated. So you need to help them with use cases, matrix. We're going to browse that just in the next slides, and then when to use what tool. So for what use cases? That's another topic we address. There's a lot of when the OCM team is engaging with customers, we try to help them to define those best practices. Like here, it's an example of a best practice when you're working on file, where to store it, and with some use case. And if you go to the next one, the matrix, it's a full matrix. And it's a way to educate users also where to store documents, and beyond each cross there's an explanation, because obviously, for example, if I need to share a document with external contacts, it depends on what your governance you put in place, and it depends if you want people to share with external contacts within a team or within OneDrive or within SharePoint. There might be different strategy depending on the customers. But definitely the departmental files and the personal file shares, if they not yet migrated, in the case that you're taking your time, maybe you can ask people to think about with this use case. Think about, maybe this file might be eligible for another place like Teams, OneDrive, or SharePoint.
All right. So in summary, we're trying to wrap up because we want to get to a couple questions here. Obviously, I think you've heard this loud and clear, all these bullet points, right? First thing you need to do is inventory. You got to know what you want to move, what makes sense to move, what gives you the best return on investment to move. Surveying the users, making sure we hear what they're thinking, how they do things, making sure we understand how the users are working. Then building that governance plan, that cutover plan. They got to go hand in hand as well. And then obviously, measure twice, cut once, plan. Make sure you get security in place. Make sure you put governance in place before you move the content. Otherwise, it's too late. It's the Wild West, right? So get that security in place. You cannot communicate enough, right? Communicate. And then you got to give them some education and training, right? So create a central support site, have a place where you park all of your documentation, all of your governance policies, make sure that there's a site or even a Microsoft team that people can go to, and they know exactly where to get the information they need to know what they can do and how to do it. And then lead by example. Get your people to evangelize this, your senior level people. Promote the change, evangelize the change, and then show them that you're actually using it as well. These are all recipes for success here. Anything else, team, that you would bring up? I think we covered them all.
Yeah, I think lead by example and evangelize. I don't know if Noah has something to say about it, but I think it's really key, because often we create good guidance, good governance. We explain that to the end users, and it's one shot, and people forget about it. I don't know, Noah, if you have any comment.
Yeah, this whole session, thanks for teeing me up. This whole session came about from an experience that I had recently with a customer. They are a year plus into their embrace of M365, the cloud, and come to find out after a your best work session that I ran with a team, they said the inertia is just so strong because we still have file shares available to us. They work fairly well, right? We're familiar with it, but what you've opened our eyes to, Noah, are some things that would really turn heads, like allowing collaboration or contributions on a Word document without actually opening it up for collaboration. It's open in review mode only, and that's only available in the cloud. And so we invited them to experiment around that, and they still 60 days later, when I checked in on them, they were still back in their file share. And so as an organization, as IT, guiding your folks towards the cloud by shutting off those file shares is a huge boon and a gift that you're giving.
Yep. And no matter how painful it is, at least you put the target date out there and you're reminding them on a recurring basis that it's going to happen, right? Right. Excellent point, Noah. Just wrapping up, we always like to end with a survey. Again, about today's session, do you have a better understanding of how and why you should move your files to the cloud? So if you could take this survey, that would be awesome for us so we can get some feedback. We would love to see the results. Next slide is just lots of content, and some of these addressed. We had some questions come in advance. One of the questions had to do about backing up. Is backup really needed in the cloud? And I can't tell you how many times I've heard that question, and this is a great debate. And it's typically, it's a really interesting conversation. But when it's all said and done, I have some resources here. Most people think that as long as you're doing due diligence and you understand how you have this configured and you've set redundant retention and you understand the defaults and all these other things that go along with setting up a tenant and making sure that you're compliant, usually that's not an issue. Backing up is something that the backup vendors push really strongly. There's a couple links here specifically about data resiliency, and it talks about why Microsoft, how they're set up for resiliency and redundancy and backups and so forth. There's this a great link here about, is backup required or critical? And then the great debate is a video about 2 years ago where AvePoint and Tony Redman, who's a Microsoft MVP, have a great debate on this topic, and it's definitely an interesting hour if you have the time to watch it. And I think both sides make good points, but I think in the end, Tony wins out, saying Microsoft does a great job. Definitely check it out if you have some time to kill. But other great resources here: data resiliency, deploying a sync client. Those are some things you're gonna have to think about. As well as other items here about migration manager tool and stuff like that. So definitely check them out. I put this here just as a reference. I'm not going to go over it, but obviously with Microsoft Purview being announced, a lot of the names have changed. So just be aware, the old name, the new updated name. I want everyone to be aware of that. And this is a nice little cheat sheet about what that's all about. We had some questions come in. We've only got a couple minutes. Let me see if I can answer some of the questions that came in. One of the questions is, how do you find files in SharePoint if dispersed among multiple site collections? Michael, go ahead.
Sorry, I had to get off mute there. So when you put your stuff into SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, it's all findable by the actual search environment. So with that, depending on if you're in the site, you can do a more site contextual search or a team contextual search. But once you put the data in there, if it's something that can be crawled and broken apart and indexed, it'll be findable via the search.
As long as you have permissions to see it, right? So this
That
was a
is
big
true,
question.
yes.
When Delve was launched, people were freaking out that they were seeing stuff that, maybe they shouldn't see, but it also helps you keep an eye on things, right? To know that permissions may be wrong on something, right? So, again, Microsoft will never, ever change the permissions on your files. It's how they've been set up. So keep an eye on that. Great.
I will add just quickly to that now in Microsoft 365 in search, you can search your Teams message, your email message, your Yammer post. So it's a really central search.
Absolutely. That's a great point, PY. That's something that's relatively new as well. There was a question about being a shared site collection. What about agencies who have shared site collections, pros and cons, like an intranet for the whole site or an agency limit? There's some limits to hubs. There used to be limits in the hubs. There's no more limits. There's like 2,000 per organization. So if anyone wants to tackle that question, go ahead.
Yeah, I've seen specifically with organizations, especially very large organizations, going back to having agencies and things like that. You do have the ability to create those hub sites for the agency. We see a lot of multi-agency tenants. So with the hub sites, it's a great way to break out those agencies and have them control their own area. You also now have the ability to do child hub sites. So with that, you can even get more structurally compatible with organizations with those child hub sites. As far as having a shared site, generally those hub sites become the shared site for that agency or that upper level sort of organization. Unless you're talking about the organization as a whole, then you're looking at something like an intranet or something along those lines where you would find those common use forms. Maybe it's travel forms or expense reimbursement forms or even policies and practices for the organization.
Excellent, excellent. And I know we're over. I'm just going to, this last one, there was a question about, in your experience, what is the average time to migrate processes and culture to OneDrive, SharePoint, and Teams? PY and OCM team, Noah, everybody else, what does it take an organization typically to go through this process? And I know it's a really hard question to answer because it depends on the organization, but what have you seen in the past?
So my usual answer is it depends.
Yeah.
It depends. It's a consulting answer. It really depends on the culture. It really depends if you're focusing on it. It really depends how you want to help end user to transition. It really depends if your files are complicated or the organization is complicated, and if you have to do some cleaning for a long time. It really depends. I think the migration by itself, it doesn't take a long time, and Michael can contradict me, but it's the work before that can be very short if you're well organized, or very complex, because if you want to give a voice to everybody to reorganize their files, then it can take time.
Thanks.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, Michael. Okay. And yeah, we can, what is a typical migration throughputs, Michael, basically that you've seen as far as how much you can push in a short period of time? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so we look at generally, it depends on the tool, depends on the client's throughput, but ultimately we look for about 1 terabyte to 2 terabytes a week. It can be faster depending on certain situations. You always have to worry about throttling with the Microsoft environment, because they obviously are wanting to make sure the environment's performant for everybody. But if you do a lot of your migration cut over, like over the weekend, when it's off business hours, that generally helps reduce the amount of throttling you may have.
Excellent. Just coming up soon, we don't have dates yet, but there'll be a date in November. And usually we have a couple weeks in between these two. We're going to do an Ignite recap on Office 365 and Power Platform announcements that just happened last month, as well as another Ignite recap for Azure and data. So be on the lookout for that in the next newsletter. And then obviously, your benefits are available to you anytime. Reach out to Michelle McGraw, or if you have any questions, shoot YouAlreadyOwnIt at go-planet.com or your account team, and we'll get you set up with some of these workshops and briefings or anything you need from the YouAlreadyOwnIt program. We're here to help. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to follow up on today's session, feel free to reach out to us anytime. Thanks for joining us. We hope you found this useful, and we'll see you next month. Thanks again.
Thank you.